The wind came before the snow. Everyone in Greystone knew this. The way they knew which roads washed out first in spring and which families could be trusted to repay a borrowed coat of firewood before January. Wind arrived as a scout, feeling out the gaps in eaves and the loose corners of plastic sheeting people had nailed over windows they never got around to fixing properly. It moved through the hollow between the two ridges that cupped the community on either side, and by the time it reached the center of the settlement, that flat half-acre of packed gravel, where the old fuel depot sat rusting beside the community water tank, it had already inventoried every weakness Greystone possessed. Sera Calloway had 10 minutes to gather what remained of her life. Harold Vance stood at the edge of the property with his hands loose at his sides. Not aggressive, not apologetic, simply present in the way of a man who had made a decision and was waiting for the world to catch up to it. He was 72 years old, thick through the shoulders, even now with a face that weather had carved into something that looked less like skin and more like the bark of a hickory tree, layered, resistant, impossible to read quickly. His coat was an old Carhartt in faded brown, the collar turned up against the wind that had arrived that morning. He had not knocked. He had simply walked onto the property at 8:15 on a Tuesday in the first week of November and stood there until Sera came to the door. She had known the way you know something is coming when the signs accumulate over weeks, and you choose not to arrange them into their obvious conclusion. Her mother's name had not been on any deed. Neither had hers. The house had been built by her father's hands on a parcel of land her father's family had occupied for 2 generations, through the kind of informal arrangement that worked fine when the patriarch was alive and became lethal the moment he wasn't. The Calloway family's claim to that ground lived entirely in the memory of the community, and memory, Sera had been learning, was a flexible thing. Her father had gone into the forest 4 years ago and come back on a stretcher. A logging chain had failed mid-pull, and the backlash had taken him across the lower back with the kind of force that didn't leave room for recovery. He had lived 11 more months, which was long enough for the medical bills to drain everything liquid and a little beyond. Her mother had kept the house, kept the garden, kept Sera in school through a combination of seasonal work and a pride so compressed it had become a kind of fuel. Then last February, the cough that had been visiting since October finally decided to stay. Without insurance, without money, without anyone in Greystone who was willing to drive 2 hours to a hospital in the middle of a frozen February night. For a woman who wasn't family, her mother had simply run out of winter. What that left was Sera, 18 years old, in possession of a 4-room house on land she could not legally defend in a community whose unwritten rules had just shifted decisively against her. Harold Vance's oldest son, Brett, had gotten married in September to a woman named Carla, who had grown up 40 miles south in a larger town, and who had particular opinions about where she was willing to live and under what conditions. Brett was 26 and had spent his whole life inside the radius of his father's influence, which meant that when Carla pointed at the Calloway property and made her case, Brett did not so much agree as simply fail to disagree. Harold had waited until the first hard frost to act, which was either a kindness or a calculation. The ground freezing meant the moral temperature of the thing was easier to ignore. Sera did not argue. She had rehearsed arguing in the 3 days since she had understood what was coming, lying on the cot in the room that had been hers since she was 4 years old, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had always looked like a running dog. She had built cases in her head, organized facts, arranged the history of her family's occupancy into something that felt like evidence. But standing at the door looking at Harold Vance's face, she understood that evidence required a venue. And the only venue in Greystone was Harold Vance's judgment. She went inside and started filling the canvas bag. 2 changes of clothing, the heavier ones. A wool blanket her mother had bought at a church sale 11 years ago and washed so many times it had softened from rough to something approaching comfort. 6 potatoes from the bin in the corner, wrapped individually in a square of linen, she cut from an old tablecloth with the kitchen scissors. A tin cup. A box of matches down to its last dozen. The steel flint her father had kept on the shelf above the workbench, the one he had used on camping trips before. His back made camping impossible. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it. The specific density of something kept, because it was useful, and put it in the bottom of the bag. Then she opened the kitchen drawer and found the paper seed envelope her mother had tucked there last spring, half full of mixed vegetable seeds sealed with a strip of tape, and pressed it flat into the bag's inside pocket. She did not know why, except that her mother had put it there, and that was reason enough. She did not take photographs. She did not take the small Bible that sat on the shelf by the door because it had belonged to her grandmother, and she did not feel entitled to it, and could not have explained why. She stood in the doorway of her parents' room for about 4 seconds. Then she closed the door gently, the way you close a door on something sleeping, and walked out of the house without looking at Harold Vance directly. The gravel crunched under her boots, and the cold came for her face immediately. That dry West Virginia cold that smells faintly of ash and pine resin, and carries a hostility that feels personal even though it isn't. She walked to the end of the property line, turned left onto the track that led out of the settlement, and kept moving. No one came out of their houses. A dog barked twice from somewhere behind the fuel depot, and then went quiet. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and uniform, and the wind came in from the north-northeast in slow sustained pushes that didn't peak and drop like gusts, but instead maintained themselves with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She did not look back. The road out of Greystone ran south for 2 miles before it reached a fork that hadn't been marked with a sign, since the original post had rotted out sometime in the 90s. Left continued south, and eventually down into the valley floor, where Route 60 connected to 3 other communities larger than Greystone, all of them strangers, all of them with their own hierarchies and their own quiet rules about who belonged and who didn't. Wright climbed east toward the upper ridge, following a track that had once been used by seasonal grazing operations and now served mainly as evidence that the land remembered having been worked even if the people had stopped. Her father had taken her up the Wright Fork when she was 12. They had gone on a Saturday in October, ostensibly to check a stretch of fence line he maintained, out of some private sense of obligation to land he didn't own, but really she understood this better. In retrospect, because he had wanted to show her something. He had shown her the ridge. He had shown her how the limestone formations on the upper face caught the afternoon light and held it differently than the forest below. He had shown her the hollow in the rock face, the shelf of stone that had fractured and receded from the main formation over some geological span of time to create a space that was less than a cave and more than a shelter, deep enough to stand in if you kept your shoulders in wide enough across for a person to lie down with room remaining. He had stood at the entrance and said nothing for a while in the way he sometimes did, and then he had said, "A person could stay dry in there through a bad one." He had meant a storm. She had understood he meant something larger. She turned right at the fork without slowing down. The climb was 40 minutes on a good day with nothing in your hands. With the canvas bag and the cold and the boots that had been resoled once and were asking for a second visit, it took closer to 2 hours. The track was still visible as a slightly more compressed version of the hillside, a thread of intention through dormant mountain grass and the occasional stand of young poplar. The wind increased with elevation in the way that felt logical once you were in it, the ridge acting as a funnel gathering and concentrating whatever the sky had to offer. Her fingers lost sensation before she reached the halfway point. She transferred the bag to one arm and kept the other hand tucked under her opposite armpit, switching every few minutes, rationing warmth the way she would ration food in the days ahead, without yet knowing exactly how bad the rationing would need to be. She had eaten half a potato raw before leaving. She had not had anything since. The hunger was not sharp yet, just present the way a sound you cannot identify sits in the back of awareness waiting to be named. The first limestone outcropping appeared around a left bend in the track, a broad shelf of grey stone projecting from the hillside like the lower lip of something vast and geological. She had been watching for it without consciously thinking about it. And when it came into view, something in her chest loosened slightly, the specific relief of a landmark found after a period of not being entirely sure. She climbed the last 50 yards to where the shelf leveled out and stopped to breathe. From here, Greystone was visible below as a pattern of rooftops and the occasional pale rectangle of a cleared lot, all of it smaller than it felt from inside. The community water tank caught what little light was coming through the clouds and reflected it as a dull smear. The fuel depot's rusted roof was the same color as the surrounding woodland in November, which was the color of things that had stopped trying. She could see Harold Vance's truck parked in front of the house that was no longer hers. She could see all of it laid out below her with the clarity of distance, and she understood with a certainty that surprised her that this perspective, high ground, unobstructed view, invisibility from below was not nothing. Her father had confirmed this when she was 12, standing on the track looking up and saying he had walked past the hollow a dozen times before he found it the first time. From below, it was just ridge. From here, it was a position. She turned away from Greystone and walked to the back of the shelf where the rock face receded into the hollow. It was exactly as she remembered, which was both reassuring and a small shock. Because 12 years is a long time and memory has a habit of improving things. But it was genuinely this 4 meters deep, 3 meters wide ceiling low enough that she had to tuck her chin to enter without scraping her head. The floor, packed earth covered in accumulated leaf fall from the 2 young pine trees whose roots reached toward the shelf. The walls were dry. The air smelled of cold stone and decaying pine needles and something mineral and old. It did not smell of animals. It did not smell of death. These were not small things. She set the bag down and stood in the interior for a while, without doing anything, letting her eyes adjust. She ran her hands along the back wall, cold through the skin, but dry, no moisture seeping through the limestone. She pressed her palm flat and held it. The stone had no warmth of its own to offer, but it was not actively pulling heat away the way wet stone does. Dry cold was manageable. Wet cold was something else entirely. She sat down on the leaf floor and took out a potato and ate it slowly in small bites without salt, chewing thoroughly, because there was no reason not to and good reasons to make it last. Outside, the wind was a continuous sound. Inside, that sound existed at a remove present, audible but not felt against skin. The distance between dying and not dying, she was beginning to understand, was not dramatic. It was a matter of degrees, literally. Night came fast in November. In the mountains, the light dropping from gray to charcoal to black over 40 minutes, without any real twilight to ease the transition. She wrapped the wool blanket around herself and sat with her back against the rear wall, knees pulled to her chest, and listened to the wind increase outside. The temperature fell with the light. She could feel it moving through the hollow entrance in a slow horizontal pull, not the sharp gust of a storm, but the steady drain of a cold that had nowhere else to be and all night to work. This was the first problem, and she identified it clearly rather than just feeling it. The hollow faced west-southwest, and the prevailing wind was from the north, catching the entrance at an angle that pushed air along the floor in a continuous low current. Cold air at floor level against the parts of her body closest to the ground, undermining the limited heat her body was generating and spending it into the stone floor before it could accumulate in the airspace around her. She noted the problem the way her father had taught her to note problems in the field. Name it, locate it, estimate its severity, then set it aside for the night. Because tonight was about survival and solutions required daylight and materials and energy she didn't have yet. She leaned her weight into the back wall, tucked the blanket around her boots, pressed her hands between her thighs, and closed her eyes. Sleep was less like sleep and more like a series of descents interrupted by the body's own monitoring system. Surface, check the temperature, descend again. But the intervals between surfacing grew longer as the night progressed, and by the time the light changed outside, something that qualified as rest had accumulated. She was out of the hollow before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The morning was brittle and clear, the kind of cold that has spent the night getting serious. She stood at the edge of the shelf and looked down at Greystone with the specific attention of someone conducting an inventory rather than someone trying to feel something. She could see which houses had smoke coming from their chimneys. She could see Brett's truck already parked beside Harold's at the property that had been hers, which meant the occupation had begun immediately, which was somehow clarifying rather than painful. Then she turned around and looked at the hillside with different eyes. The loose stone on the slope below the shelf came in two useful sizes. The large angular pieces were impossible to move alone. The smaller ones, flat oval, roughly the size of two fists pressed together, had collected in natural piles on either side of where the shelf jutted out. She picked one up and turned it in her hands. Heavy enough to have substance, light enough to carry. Its broad faces were relatively smooth and would stack with some stability. She built the wall that morning. The concept came from something she had watched her father do with the goat pen when she was 8. A low partition knee-height positioned across the mouth of the hollow, not to seal it, but to interrupt the floor-level wind current without blocking the airspace above. Ventilation above, draft block below. The animals had needed air, but not drafts. So did she. She moved stones from the collection points flanking the shelf, carrying them two at a time, rolling the larger ones when they weren't manageable otherwise. She stacked them in a rough course along the entrance threshold, fitting flat face to flat face, tolerating irregularity where she couldn't do better. Filling the larger gaps with handfuls of mud she dug from beneath the leaf layer at the hollow's back corner. The mud was nearly frozen and fought her hands. Her knuckles cracked and started bleeding in thin lines she ignored. The mud went into the gaps reluctantly, but once stiffened by the wind, it would function as mortar for at least a week, which was all she needed from it right now. When she stepped back and looked at what she had built, it was not beautiful, a low, irregular rampart of mismatched limestone with visible mud seams, looking more like a minor hillside collapse than deliberate construction. But when she stood inside and turned to face out, the floor-level current was gone. The air above the wall moved freely. The air at her feet was still. The floor came next. The accumulated leaf fall was several inches deep, but the problem was compression body weight, flattened leaves within minutes, and once flat, they lost almost all their thermal resistance. She needed something with structural resilience that would maintain loft under weight and hold the air gaps that made insulation work. She had noticed moss on the north-facing surfaces of the secondary limestone formations, 100 meters further up the ridge, where a temperature differential kept the ground in a perpetual state of cold damp. She climbed to it now and found it as she had remembered, dark green going gray at the edges, compact and deep, pulling away from the rock in intact slabs when she worked her fingers underneath. She made 4 trips, carrying each load pressed against her chest, feeling the cold seep through her jacket from the moss's stored moisture. Inside the hollow, she layered it directly over the leaves, pressing it down to seat it against the leaf base, and then allowing it to recover loft. She built the layer wide enough for her full body length and slightly wider than her shoulders. When she lay down to test it, she felt the insulation work the way good materials work, not with warmth exactly, but with the cessation of cold. The ground's claim on her body's heat was interrupted. Her thermal energy stopped bleeding downward. She lay there for 3 minutes staring at the curved ceiling and ran through what remained. Water was the most urgent problem she had not yet solved. Fire she could manage. Food she could extend, but protein would become critical within 10 days of living on root vegetables alone, and her ability to work and think would begin degrading before she felt it happening, which was the most dangerous kind of degradation. She got up and began collecting fire materials. The pine trees flanking the hollow entrance had accumulated dead lower branches and dry needlefall at the base of their trunks, sheltered from precipitation by the canopy above and from ground moisture by the shelf surface beneath. She collected these into a pile inside the entrance, then added sections of bark she stripped from a fallen log higher on the slope. She positioned the fire near the entrance behind the new wall, close enough for the smoke to exit upward through the air gap, far enough in for the wall to deflect the floor-level wind that would otherwise snuff the flame before it took hold. The first strike of the flint produced a spark that landed and went cold. The second the same. On the fifth strike, a small orange tongue caught in the dry needle nest, and Sera cupped her hands around it immediately, leaning her body against the wind blowing in the slow, measured way her father had shown her. Not a breath, but an extension of attention, thin and sustained. The smoke thickened. The flame made the decision to stay. It lasted less than an hour, but it heated 2 potatoes and the water in the tin cup. And when Sera drank the hot water, she felt the warmth travel through her chest and settle in her stomach with an authority that the cold had not managed to match. She sat with her knees pulled up and the blanket around her shoulders and watched the coals reduce to ash. And she thought clearly for the first time in days, not about Greystone, not about Harold Vance, but about the list. The list of what she needed in order of urgency, with the beginning of an approach for each item. The list was long, but it was a list, not chaos, and a list was the beginning of everything. The first flake of snow for the season crossed the entrance of the hollow past 10 o'clock that night, drifting in on a wind shift and settling on the flat top of her new wall. She watched it land, stay for a moment, and then sublimate in the upward warmth from the still glowing coals. Another followed, then several at once. Outside, the first accumulation of the year began softening the edges of the limestone formations layering the hillside in something that looked like forgiveness, but was only weather. Inside, behind a low wall of mismatched stone that no one had helped her build beside coals she had coaxed from material collected with cracked and bleeding hands, Sera pulled the blanket tight and thought about the morning. Not about the community that had pointed down the road and called it a direction. About the morning. About what she would do with it. Greystone had given her the ridge. They had given her the silence and the cold, and the particular clarity that arrives when everything unnecessary has been stripped away, leaving only you and the problem in front of you, and the absolute democracy of physical reality, which does not consult anyone's authority before deciding what survives. She would use all of it. December arrived the way it always did in the Upper Appalachians. Not as a date on a calendar, but as a physical fact. A renegotiation of terms between the mountain and everything living on it. The temperature dropped in increments that were individually survivable and collectively relentless. The ground hardened to the consistency of compressed concrete below the first 2 inches of soil. The deciduous trees finished their retreat into bare architecture, their stripped branches making the forest feel larger and more exposed, the way a room feels larger when the furniture is removed. Sera had been on the ridge for 3 weeks when the potatoes ran out. She had known the day was coming with the precision of someone who has been counting. 6 potatoes at the start, 1 eaten the first night, the remaining 5 rationed across 18 days by cutting them smaller, each time boiling them in the tin cup. To make the starch more accessible, drinking the cooking water for whatever residual nutrition it carried. The last one she ate on a Tuesday morning, watching the steam rise from the tin cup and dissipate in the cold air outside. She noted the fact of its being the last without ceremony, the way you note the final mile of a long drive. Not because you've arrived somewhere good, but because the thing you were counting toward has resolved. The hunger that followed was different from the hunger that had preceded it. Before, hunger had been an inconvenience managed by the knowledge of the next ration. After, it became a kind of weather of its own, ambient, omnidirectional, impossible to face in any one direction and make stop. Her body adjusted to it over several days, with the grudging pragmatism of biological systems, reducing her energy demands in ways she could feel as a slight loosening of mental speed, a tendency to pause mid-movement before committing to the next action. She had already started building the supplementary food system before the potatoes were gone, because her father had been clear on this principle. The worst time to learn a new skill was the moment you needed it. The pine trees flanking the hollow entrance produced seeds, small calorie dense, protected in cones that had been closing over the summer. She had been collecting them since early November, prying them open with a flat stone and extracting the seeds with her thumbnail, storing them in a fold of linen at the bottom of the canvas bag. 20 minutes of work for a tablespoon of seeds. A tablespoon of pine seeds contained enough fat and protein to matter. The birch trees lower on the slope offered something less elegant but functional. The thin white cambium just below the outer bark could be scraped free, boiled in water, and consumed as a loose starchy paste. It tasted like wet cardboard with an undertone of something faintly astringent, and it was filling in the way that bulk fills you, rather than the way nutrition fills you. But the distinction between the two becomes academic when the alternative is neither. She supplemented this with shelf mushrooms she found on the undersurfaces of downed logs, and with dried service berries she found still clinging to branches in sheltered north-facing pockets where the birds hadn't reached. The rabbit problem occupied her thinking for the first 2 weeks of December, and her failure at it before her eventual success had educational content. She had known the principles since childhood. Winter rabbits run fixed corridors, the same paths pressed into the snow by repetition until they become reliable grooves. She knew how to build a snare from a bent sapling and a length of cordage. What she had underestimated was the specificity required in practice. The first snare was positioned correctly in construction, but placed on a section of trail the rabbits had apparently already shifted away from. The second attempt was closer on the third morning. She found the loop displaced and a confusion of tracks around it, meaning a rabbit had interacted with the snare without being caught because she had set the trigger tension too tight. She adjusted the tension. She raised the loop height by half an inch. She walked away and did not check it again until the following afternoon, because checking too often disturbed the sight and more dangerously disturbed her own patience. The third snare held a rabbit. She prepared it without lingering, her hands working quickly in the cold with muscle memory from a skill practiced at 12 and unused since. She used the tin cup to collect the fat that rendered during cooking, because rendered fat stored well and had caloric density she couldn't discard. She saved the bones and boiled them the next morning for what marrow and collagen they yielded, and drank that too. After the rabbit, she was eating above the critical threshold where thinking becomes reliable. She kept the snare operational from that point forward, resetting it every 2 days, alternating locations along the trail she had mapped over 400 meters of slope. Success rate was roughly 1 in 3 settings, which was enough. The problem of cold during the deepest part of the night had been partially addressed by the stone heating system she had begun developing in mid-November, but December tested its limits. The flat limestone pieces she had been heating by the fire and placing along her sleeping area retained warmth adequately through the first half of the night, but were exhausted by 3 in the morning, precisely when the ambient temperature reached its lowest point. She needed more thermal mass. She spent 2 afternoons rolling a pair of substantial flat-bottom stones from a formation 40 meters up the slope, using a pry bar fashioned from a straight ash sapling to shift them over each intervening drop. They were too large to carry and required full body effort to move even on level ground. Getting them to the hollow took 3 hours the first day and 2 the second, for a distance an unburdened person would have covered in 6 minutes. She did not find this ironic. She found it necessary. The larger stones took longer to heat fully. She needed to maintain the fire an additional 2 hours to bring them to sufficient temperature. But once heated, they released warmth over a much longer duration, carrying significant heat past the critical 4 in the morning threshold and sometimes into the early gray light of dawn. By mid-December, the system was producing genuine rest, the kind of restoration that made complex thinking available the following morning. The solar gain observation came from a clear stretch of days in the second week of January, when a high-pressure system settled over the central Appalachians and held the sky at a hard blue for 6 consecutive days. Those days were paradoxically the coldest of the winter. Clear skies meant no insulating cloud layer at night, and temperatures dropped to points that made the pine trees above the hollow tick and crack in the dark with the sound of wood under structural stress. She kept the fire higher on those nights and burned through her wood reserve faster than she liked. And that inefficiency forced her attention to the question of where she might source heat without fuel cost. The answer came on the fourth clear afternoon. She had placed her hand on the outer face of the stone wall she had built in November, and it was warm, noticeably genuinely warm, in a way that the same stone at the previous evening's temperature had not been. The sun had been working on it for 3 hours, and the stone had accepted the work and stored it. She pressed her palm to a pale limestone piece, and then to a darker shale fragment she had incorporated for convenience. The dark piece was measurably warmer. It came to her then, the way things came to her, when the answer had been assembling below the level of conscious thought. Before surfacing, the dark stones on the road into Greystone had always shed their eyes first in winter mornings. She had noticed this since childhood without filing it as information. Now it was a principle. Dark surfaces absorb more radiant energy at the same exposure. Dark stone in a wall facing southwest accumulates significantly more solar heat than light stone in the same position. She rebuilt the upper courses of the wall over 2 days, sourcing the darkest available stone from the slope, a shale that fractured in useful flat plains, whose surface was almost gray-black, and repositioning it in the top 2 courses where solar exposure was greatest. She increased the wall's overall thickness at the same time, incorporating a clay-rich subsoil mixed with dry grass from the hillside, the grass adding fibrous structure that prevented cracking during the thermal cycling of heating and cooling. The result was a wall with significantly more mass and a solar-absorbing surface that began contributing measurable warmth to the hollow's entrance side by the 3rd day after reconstruction. Sun in the afternoon, stone through the night. The system was not sophisticated. It was only the application of what the mountain had always been doing, directed now with intention. The 6 days of clear weather were also the days when she first saw the figure below. She had been outside on the shelf working on the wall's upper course when movement at Greystone's southern boundary drew her attention. A person too far for features standing at the community's edge looking upward. They stood for what she estimated as 4 minutes, long enough to be purposeful, and then turned and walked back toward the settlement's center. She held very still, the way people hold still when they understand they may be visible. She did not know the figure was June Holt. She knew only that someone had looked deliberately toward the ridge for long enough to mean something, and that the smoke from her fire was the identifying element, thin and vertical, on calm days visible from the valley below as evidence of habitation. She could not eliminate it without eliminating the fire. Someone below knew she was alive. What that knowledge would generate in Greystone, she could not predict, and she decided not to try. The night of December 23rd had been the one exception to the discipline she had built around forward thinking. She had not been able to sleep, and in the failure to sleep, she had been available to a thought she had been successfully deferring for 7 weeks. The thought was clean and reasonable, and therefore more dangerous than despair would have been. There is a valley below you, with heated houses and people who know your name and food in cellars. And all of it is available if you walk down the mountain and say you were wrong and you need help. She lay with it for 2 hours. She did not dismiss it. She turned it over and examined it from its functional side and its personal side, and the side that had to do with what remained of her when everything social and contextual was stripped away. The functional case was sound survival probability increased with access to resources, full stop. But there was another calculation, one that didn't have a name she could point to but was no less real for that. The version of her that descended that mountain with nothing to show for what she had built would not be able to hold her own gaze for a long time afterward. Not in front of others, that was the smaller part. In the privacy of her own assessment of herself, the place no one else ever reached. Some costs are paid not in immediate suffering, but in the slow erosion of the capacity to trust your own judgment. And that erosion, once started, is harder to stop than any cold. She stayed on the ridge, By morning, the decision had calcified into something that no longer required defending, and she got up and went to check the snare, and the day resumed its ordinary shape. February began with a week of unsettled weather. Alternating precipitation, freezing and thawing, the kind of pattern hard on everything built by human hands. Because the expansion and contraction of frozen water in any gap or joint was more destructive over time than sustained cold or sustained warmth. She had repointed the wall's lower course twice and begun incorporating longer flat stones as through bonds across its thickness to prevent the face courses from separating under frost pressure. She was working on the wall's east corner on a Thursday morning in the first week of February when she looked up at the sky to the northeast. The clouds were a particular color, not the flat pewter of ordinary winter overcast, but a yellowish-gray sitting lower than usual with a bottom edge that looked almost solid the way cloud decks look when they are carrying serious moisture and have already decided what to do with it. The wind had shifted overnight from northwest to northeast, unusual in this region, and her father's voice arrived in her memory with the clarity of something that had been waiting to be useful. Northeast wind in February means it's coming from somewhere that's already had it. Means it's not done yet. She had 6 hours, possibly fewer. She spent the first 3 breaking 2 reserved fallen logs into manageable lengths and stacking them in a crosshatch pattern deep under the shelf overhang, where the rock above extended furthest against precipitation. She reinforced the wall, packed linen around the base of the interior walls to protect the soil preparation she had been building since January, and filled every water container she had from the spring 40 meters up the slope. She built the fire up deliberately and heated all 4 flat heating stones to their maximum before the afternoon light failed arranging them in the semicircle configuration that had proved most efficient. The storm hit after dark and hit seriously. Wind that wasn't the usual sustained push, but a different creature entirely variable in direction, gusting to points that made the pine trees above the hollow sound like they were being wrung, accompanied by snow that was wet and heavy in its first hours, and then dried and granular as the temperature dropped behind the front. The fire was difficult to maintain because the wind kept finding angles that pushed smoke back into the hollow interior, and she spent the first night sleeping low pressed against the floor where the air was cleaner. The blanket over her face breathing the pocket of warmth maintained between her body and the ground. The second night was colder and more stable in wind direction, which was worse in one sense. Sustained cold penetrates more completely than variable cold, but better in another, because she could manage the fire reliably and heat the stones through without interruption. She burned more wood than she had budgeted by the end of the 3rd day, and by the 5th she understood the storm was not a single event, but a settled condition. The kind of sustained winter assault the mountains produced once or twice a decade, and that people who survived them carried as a reference point for the rest of their lives. Below her in Greystone, Dale Marsh's storage roof came down on the 3rd night. She did not know this yet. She did not know that Roy Dunbar, 79 years old, widowed for a decade, living alone at the settlement's northern end, in a house where the firewood had always run shorter than it should have been, found on the 5th day, his hands folded across his chest in the attitude of a man who had made his peace before the cold finished making its point. She did not know that 3 households had reduced their children's portions to half in order to stretch what remained in the family cellars, or that the power had been out since the 2nd day, or that June Holt was sitting in her kitchen in the dark with her youngest daughter on her lap and her 2 older boys on the floor under every blanket in the house. And that June was thinking clearly and with complete focus about a thread of smoke she had watched rise from the ridge on a clear afternoon 3 weeks ago, thin and steady and unhurried, rising from a place where everyone below had assumed nothing capable of persisting could persist. On the 7th morning, the storm broke. Sera emerged from the hollow into a world simplified by several feet of snow. The shelf covered the slope below, transformed to an unmarked white surface that erased the track she had climbed in November as completely as if it had never been pressed into the ground. The air was still, The sky was the hard, deep blue of after-storm clarity without compromise. She made broth from the last of the saved bones and the dried service berries she had stored in October, boiling everything together until the liquid was dark and faintly sweet and slightly bitter at once. She drank it standing at the edge of the shelf, looking down at Greystone through air so clear. It felt like a different medium than the air of the previous week. The community below was a white surface interrupted by rooftops. She counted the chimneys not producing smoke 135. 5 houses with coal chimneys on a morning this clear and cold, when every house that had fuel and fire would be burning. She stood with the empty tin cup and looked at those dark chimney tops for a long time. What she felt was not satisfaction and not guilt. It was heavier than either and quieter. It was the weight of understanding. That knowledge has a kind of gravity. It pulls toward the places where it is needed most. And that the knowledge she had accumulated on the ridge over the past 3 months had become without her planning it that way. Exactly the kind of knowledge that the situation below was generating the conditions to require. Behind her, the sun was climbing toward the angle that would hit the wall's dark upper course and begin its slow daily work of storing what could be stored. Everything she had built had held. Whatever came next, she would meet it from this ground. Dale Marsh and Tom Ricker reached the shelf on the 8th morning after the storm, and the climb had taken them the better part of 3 hours through snow that had crusted overnight into something that held your weight for a half second before collapsing, which meant every step was a small betrayal, the surface promising support, and then withdrawing it at the last moment. They had used wooden fence posts as walking staves, and they arrived at the shelf breathing hard, their pant legs soaked to the knee. Dale was 54, a man built for endurance rather than speed, with a broad, flat face that had never learned to hide what it was thinking. He had run Greystone's community storage operation for 11 years, which meant he was the person most precisely aware of what the storm had cost them. Not in emotional terms, but in tonnage, in weeks of food supply, in the specific arithmetic of what his community needed versus what remained. He looked at the wall, at the fire placement, at the organized stack of wood under the shelf overhang, at the sleeping area visible through the entrance with its layered floor, and the flat stones arranged along the back wall. He looked at all of it for a long time with the expression of someone performing an involuntary recalculation. Tom Rickert stood slightly behind Dale and observed the same things with the careful economy of a man who had grown up in small communities and understood that the wrong sentence could take years to forget. He said nothing, but his eyes moved the way the eyes of someone attentive move, not passively registering, but actively storing. Dale's voice, when it came, was abraded by cold, and something else the roughness was covering. Roy Dunbar's gone. My storage roof caved in. The kids don't have enough. Sera looked at him for a moment, not the hesitation of someone uncertain what to say, but the brief pause of someone deciding how much of what they feel to let into their face. Then she said, "Come in, water's hot." They sat beside the fire and she gave them the broth she had made that morning, divided between the tin cup and a hollowed section of bark she had fashioned 2 weeks ago. They drank without talking. The smoke moved correctly up and out through the air gap above the wall, which he noted they both observed the specific attention of people who had recently had reason to think carefully about fire management in enclosed spaces. When Dale set down the cup, he looked at the wall again, and this time his eyes moved with the focus of a man trying to understand a mechanism rather than simply observe a result. She showed him the wall first, because understanding it required grasping the principle before the details, that a low obstruction at floor level changes the thermal dynamics of a space more than the same material deployed higher, because cold air is dense and travels along floors, and stopping it at the source costs almost nothing. She walked them along the exterior face and pointed out the dark shale in the upper courses, and explained what she had noticed about differential solar absorption and how the increased mass extended the thermal release through the early morning hours when ambient temperature bottomed out. Dale crouched down and pressed his palm against the dark upper course the way she had pressed hers on the afternoon she first noticed the warmth. He held it there, His expression did not change, but something in his posture settled slightly. The way a person's posture settles when a fact they suspected is confirmed rather than contradicted. She showed them the floor insulation and explained the compression problem with leaf litter alone. She showed them the stone heating system and explained the timing heat them for 2 hours minimum. Before sleeping, place them in a semicircle rather than a line which distributed thermal release across a wider surface. She showed them the fire placement and the smoke pathway, and the reason the entrance needed to remain partially open rather than fully sealed. Because a fully sealed space with a fire becomes uninhabitable faster than a cold space, and the wall geometry eliminated the need to choose between them. Tom Rickert had been quiet throughout, and his eyes had been on everything she pointed to. At the end of the tour, he looked at the soil preparation in the back corner. The dark mixture in its depression with something happening at its surface that was not yet visible at a casual glance, but that a person paying attention could detect as a slight change in color and texture, the earliest suggestion of biological activity. He did not ask about it, but he looked at it the way you look at something you intend to think about later. They left before noon, working back down the slope with their fence posts, and she watched them from the shelf until the angle of the slope took them below her sight line. The interaction had lasted less than 2 hours, and almost none of it had been personal. No accounting for the past, no inventory of what had happened in November, no negotiation about what was owed in any direction. She found she preferred it this way. Reckoning required energy that the situation could not afford, and neither she nor Dale Marsh had the luxury of extended backward looking. 2 more men came the following afternoon. Then a family the day after that. A father and his teenage son and a younger daughter he carried on his back for the upper section, where the snow was still knee-deep. They came with questions rather than crisis, which meant word was traveling, and people were beginning to distinguish between needing rescue and needing information. She answered the questions without embellishment. She said what she knew and how she had learned it and where the limitations were. June Holt arrived on the 11th day after the storm alone, except for her youngest child, on her back in a carrier fashioned from a moving blanket. Her 2 older sons had been left with a neighbor at the base of the ridge. She climbed with a focused steadiness that Sera could see even from a distance, no wasted motion, no pausing to rest where resting wasn't efficient, the posture of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it rather than reconsidering it in transit. She set her offering on the flat stone beside the hollow entrance without ceremony. A piece of hard cheddar and a loaf of dark bread, dense and close-grained, the kind that kept for weeks. Then she turned and looked at Sera directly, not the slightly averted gaze of apology, not the level gaze of confrontation, but the direct attention of a woman trying to see something clearly that she has been looking at from the wrong angle for too long. June was 41, broad through the shoulders, with hands that showed the specific roughness of someone who had worked with them for decades. Her face had the quality of mountain faces, generally not hardened exactly, but settled with lines that had been earned rather than accumulated. Her youngest daughter regarded Sera from the carrier with the complete unguarded curiosity of a child who hasn't yet learned to filter what she finds interesting. June did not explain herself. She did not explain where she had been standing in November, when a girl with a canvas bag had walked past the edge of the community without a single voice raised in her direction. Some debts cannot be settled with explanation, and June Holt was perceptive enough to understand the difference between the accounting she owed and the accounting Sera had requested, which was none. "Show me the rocks." June said the sentence stripped of everything except the essential. Sera looked at her for a moment, the woman and the child on her back, and the bread and the cheese on the stone between them. Then she turned and began pointing. She showed June everything she had shown the others, and some things she hadn't, because June asked questions that pushed past the operational level into the principle level. Not just how to stack the stones, but why the orientation mattered. Not just which moss to use, but why compression resistance was the relevant property, not just how to heat stones, but how to calibrate the timing based on mass rather than elapsed time. These were the questions of someone who intended to teach what she was learning. Sera answered them accordingly, going deeper than she had gone with anyone else. The child on June's back fell asleep at some point during the second hour, and June shifted her weight without interrupting the conversation. They were sitting on the shelf by then, looking out over the white slope and the valley below, and the afternoon sun was doing its work on the dark upper course of the wall. And it occurred to Sera that this was the closest thing to an ordinary human exchange she had had in more than 3 months. Not extraordinary, not weighted. Just two people in the cold talking about things that mattered, each bringing something the other could use. When June left, she paused at the top of the descent and turned back. Her voice carried the flatness of a statement rather than a question. People are already calling it Calloway's Hollow. Sera stood at the edge of the shelf and let that land without responding to it. She watched June descend until the slope's angle took her below the sight line, and then she stood alone in the still air with the afternoon sun on the dark face of the wall and the distant sounds of Greystone below, beginning to resume their ordinary rhythms. Over the following 2 weeks, Greystone changed, not through announcement or assembly. It changed the way practical necessity always changes things quietly without ceremony. Through the accumulation of individual decisions made in cold kitchens by people who had looked at their children and concluded that pride was a luxury item whose value had been revised significantly downward by the previous 3 weeks. Dale Marsh's collapsed storage roof was rebuilt with a method Greystone had not used before. Compressed moss packed between the structural beams and the surface material functioning as thermal insulation against heat loss from below and cold penetration from above. 2 other storage structures received the same treatment before the end of February. Animal shelters were modified with low exterior berms blocking floor-level drafts while preserving ventilation higher up. The specific configuration appeared in 3 different enclosures within 10 days, built by people who had learned it from neighbors, who had learned it from other neighbors. The original source becoming less visible with each transmission. The way practical knowledge always travels not as formal instruction, but as demonstration, one pair of hands showing another. The hot stone exchange became the most visible change because it required coordination between households. On the coldest nights, stones that had been heated in one household's fire would be passed in tin containers from door to door along the community's main track, a chain of transferred warmth moving through the settlement in the early evening and again at midnight. The logistics had been worked out between June Holt and 2 other women, without any formal meeting being recorded. It simply began operating the way functional systems begin, when the need is clear enough and the solution is obvious enough, and the question of credit has been rendered irrelevant by the urgency of application. Harold Vance watched these changes from the position he occupied in most things at the center, without moving. He was not an unintelligent man. He was a man whose authority had been coextensive with his community's survival for long enough that he had lost the ability to distinguish between the two, which meant any challenge to one felt like a threat to the other. He had not climbed the ridge. He had not acknowledged Sera Calloway's name in any context that anyone reported back to her. But June had spoken the name in his presence once in the doorway of his house during a conversation about the remaining storage reconstruction projects. She had referred to the moss layering technique and noted without emphasis that Sera Calloway had worked out the compression properties over several weeks of testing and that the results were reliable. Harold had looked at the middle distance between himself and June's left shoulder. He had not spoken. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Not apology, not acknowledgement in any form he could be held to, but the private shift that sometimes precedes both. June recognized its weight and left it in place without pressing. Some things cannot be rushed without breaking. And what she wanted from Harold Vance was not a performance of remorse, but the genuine rearrangement beneath it. March arrived with the snow still deep on the upper slope, but with a light that was different from January's light, higher in the sky, warmer in its spectrum, carrying the lengthening of days that the body registers before the mind does, as a slight loosening of the sustained contraction that winter requires. The runoff from the storm's accumulation was beginning in the lower sections of the hillside, and the spring above the hollow was running stronger than it had all winter. And in the soil preparation at the hollow's back corner, things were happening. She had first noticed it in the second week of February, a change in the surface texture of the mixture that was not visible at a casual glance, but unmistakable once you were looking for it. A slight lifting, a rearrangement of the surface particles consistent with what happens when something pushes upward from below with very small force. She had not mentioned it to anyone who visited, not because she was possessive of it, but because it was not yet a thing to be spoken about. It was a thing to watch the way you watch a held breath, not exhaling until you know whether it resolves into a word or simply releases. By early March, with the light coming through the hollow entrance at a higher angle and reaching the back wall for the first time since October, there were 3 distinct seedlings. They were pale in their lower stems and greening at the tips, thin and slightly tentative in the way of things that have grown in limited light, but structurally sound, the root systems clearly established in the prepared soil. The stems showing no sign of the failure that comes when a seedling has pushed up into conditions it cannot sustain. The seed envelope her mother had tucked into the bag last spring, which Sera had not consciously known she was preserving for this purpose, had delivered something forward into the world that her mother's hands would never tend. June came back in the second week of March, moving up the slope with the ease of someone who had made the climb several times and knew where the footing was reliable. She stood in the hollow entrance and looked at the seedlings for a long moment. Then she looked at Sera with an expression that had moved past assessment into something quieter and more settled. "They're talking about fixing up your folks' house," June said, and left the weight of it in the air between them to find its own level. Sera looked down at the pale stems and the green tips catching the March light through the hollow entrance. She felt the offer's shape, clearly the return it implied. The normalization it represented, the particular kind of reconciliation that communities extend when they want to close a chapter without reading it aloud. She understood what it would mean to accept it. She also understood with the same structural clarity that had kept her on the ridge through January what it would mean to decline. She had not built this place to be a way station. She had not spent 4 months learning how stone holds heat and moss resists compression, and dark surfaces drink sunlight in order to carry that knowledge back inside the community that had defined her as someone without a claim to ground. Not because she was bitter that had burned through a long time ago somewhere in the early weeks, when keeping herself alive had required too much attention for anything that wasn't immediately useful, but because the hollow on the ridge was hers, in a way the house in Greystone had never quite been. Not even when her father was alive, because it was hers, through making rather than through inheritance. And the difference between those 2 forms of ownership was the difference between a thing you hold and a thing that holds you. "Tell them I said thank you," Sera said, and her voice was level, carrying neither rejection nor explanation. Just the simple fact of a decision made from solid ground. June held her gaze for a long moment, and then nodded once, the nod of a woman who has enough respect for another woman's reasoning to accept it, without requiring it to be justified further. She stayed another hour, and they talked about the spring planting, what the hollow's microclimate might support once the ground outside was workable, whether the south-facing wall would push the effective frost-free date earlier than the valley below. They talked practically technically in the register that had established itself as the working language between them. Not impersonal, but intimate in the way that shared problem-solving is intimate, because it requires revealing how you actually think rather than how you want to appear to think. In April, the ground outside the hollow became workable in the sections of the shelf where the south-facing wall had extended the frost-free zone by what she estimated as 2 to 3 weeks compared to the open slope. She transplanted the 3 seedlings from the interior into a prepared bed along the wall's sun-facing exterior, where the dark stone would continue functioning as a heat sink through the variable temperatures of early spring, protecting the root zones from the late frosts that still arrived without warning in the mountains. She planted the remainder of the seed envelope beside them. The soil she had prepared through the winter was performing as she had intended, receiving moisture without pooling, warming in the afternoon light, carrying the structural character of ground that had been made ready for something. In the first week of May, she found a second spring lower on the slope in a section of hillside she had been working for materials since March. It surfaced not as a seep, but as a genuine small flow between two limestone plates, clear and cold, and running at a rate suggesting a source deeper than winter melt. She tasted it carefully. Clean. She filled her cup. Clean. The two springs together gave her more water than she could use alone, which changed the calculus of what was plantable and how much, and which also meant, in a way she did not name, but understood, that the ridge had more capacity than any single person would ever fully require. She stood by the new spring with the full cup in her hands and looked back up the slope toward the shelf, toward the hollow entrance visible from here as a dark rectangle in the pale stone face with the thin thread of morning fire smoke barely visible in the warm spring air. 4 months ago, she had walked up this slope in November, cold, with 6 potatoes and a flint, and the seed envelope her mother had placed in a drawer without knowing it was a gift. She had been given nothing since then that she had not found or made or reasoned into existence. The ground around her was coming green at the margins of the snowmelt zones. The sky above the ridge was a deep, unencumbered blue. The ordinary sounds of Greystone below drifted up the slope on the mild upslope breeze, a dog, a hammer, a voice calling a name, the sounds of a community in the process of its morning. 3 families had built supplementary shelters on the ridges flanking the settlement by the end of April. Not as primary residences, but as emergency refugees and seasonal storage constructed on principles all 3 families had learned either directly from Sera or through the chain of neighbors who had carried the knowledge back down. None of the shelters looked exactly like the hollow. They had been adapted to their specific sites, to the particular geometries of the rock, available to the preferences and capabilities of the people who built them. This was correct. The principle was not the hollow. The principle was observation applied to specific conditions, and that principle by its nature produced different results in different places. Knowledge that could only be applied in one location was not knowledge, it was a recipe. What she had found on the ridge was something closer to a method, and methods traveled. She was not going back to the settlement. Not because she couldn't not, because she was still waiting for something from below to change before she would consent. She was not going back because she was already somewhere, and the somewhere she was already at had taken everything she had to build, and it was hers in the way that only the things you make from nothing are ever completely yours. You could not be dispossessed of what you had made out of cold and stone, and the long patience of someone who had decided in the dark of a December night that the self was not a thing she was willing to trade away for warmth. Calloway's Hollow. The name had spread the way her father's name had spread, through certain stretches of the upper ridge, the way her mother's approach to winter. Preserving still lived in the practice of women in Greystone who didn't know where it had come from. Embedded in use, sustained by utility, requiring no maintenance because the people who found it useful kept it alive simply by continuing to find it useful. Not a monument, not a marker. The kind of name that lives in the mouth rather than on paper, in the ordinary transaction of directing each other through the world, which is where the names that last have always lived. Outside, the last of the ridge's snow was retreating into the north-facing crevices, where it would hold another week, and then be gone. The wall stood in the afternoon light, its dark upper course warm to the touch, its mud joints holding through their 3rd month. The springs ran. The snare line remained set more from habit now than necessity. Along the prepared bed outside the entrance, the seedlings had rooted into the south-facing soil and were putting on height with the steady, unhurried intention of things that have found their ground and intend to stay in it. The story of a girl expelled from a community in November who climbed a mountain alone with 6 potatoes and a flint, and her dead father's understanding of how cold worked and who came down from that mountain in spring. Not as a supplicant or a survivor, but as someone who had built something from nothing and was therefore in the most fundamental sense available to a human being. Free that story would be told in Greystone, for as long as there were people in Greystone who remembered what February had cost them and understood what had gotten them through it. It would be simplified in the telling, as stories always are. The technical details would blur. The emotional arc would clarify. What would remain in the version passed from parent to child in the decades that followed was the essential thing: that knowledge applied with patience and without self-pity is a form of power that no authority can revoke, because it does not reside in permission. It resides in the person who earned it, and it goes where that person goes, and it builds what that person decides to build. Inside the hollow on the dark prepared earth along the back wall, a fourth seedling had pushed through the surface while she was standing at the spring. She found it when she came back in for the evening, a pale thread of green in the dimming light, oriented precisely toward the entrance and the last of the day beyond it. She crouched down and looked at it for a while without touching it. Then she built the evening fire, settled the heating stones into position, and let the ridge go quiet around her, the way it went quiet every night, not empty but complete.